he sees a message embedded inside that malware, inside that virus that says, leave me here. This is his mentor. This is Mr. Robot. This is his awakening and his call. And we have the C storyline, finally. Will Elliot team up with Mr. Robot to break down the system? And Elliot has a dilemma because as an employee, he's there to get rid of this, to root this out, but he decides to leave the message there because he wants to meet Mr. Robot. And he says, I don't want to delete it. I want it to stay. Will he team up with Mr. Robot? The question is answered right from the beginning, maybe. Now, Act 2 ends with our first M point, which is, remember our BMMOC story question is he going to break down the villain? Is he going to team up with Mr. Robot to break down the villain? And in the end of our act, we see Mr. Robot and him on a subway. And Mr. Robot says to him, I want to break you out of your prison. I want you to work for me. And in order for him to do that, though, we have a great ticking clock. Watch the show. Mr. Robot gets off the subway and says, if you want to work with me, you're going to join me. If you don't, just stay where you are. And Elliot sits and sits and sits. And as the doors begin to close, voom, he goes through them. And he is going to be with Mr. Robot. Will he hook up with Mr. Robot? That's the C storyline question. And it looks like he is. He now goes with Mr. Robot to Coney Island, to the robot's lair. And he is going to see that what they're all doing there, what all the hackers are doing there, is they are fighting against the big corporation. They're figuring out a way to beat them. But he leaves them not knowing for sure if he's going to join them or not. And when he gets back to his apartment, we get back to the B storyline because who is waiting for him? Angela. Will he connect with Angela? Caring and confidence. She says to him, I'm glad you're here. Do you want to go in and get high and watch Netflix? Which we all know is a bit of a pseudonym. She wants to hook up with him. Will he? He says yes. But when they get inside, Elliot's drug dealer and friend with benefits is there. So Angela and Elliot do not connect. This is critical. She leaves. Now, he decides to go back to see Mr. Robot again. And we're back to the C storyline. Will he hook up with Mr. Robot? And here's when Mr. Robot poses an irresistible question to Elliot. What if you could take down the one conglomerate that is the most evil conglomerate in the world? What if I told you that this conglomerate is something that controls all of us through our debt? Well, that's what Elliot wants to do more than anything else. And Mr. Robot says, if you get together with me, Elliot, we can wipe out the biggest villain in the world. Now, Elliot doesn't want to commit now. Mr. Robot says, here's a data file. Put it in the system, and it will frame Terry Colby, who we think, and he thinks, is the real villain, and get rid of him. He'll be thrown out of the E Corporation. Elliot says, but he's just one guy. Mr. Robot says, that's how we start. You don't do this all at once. So the invitation has been given. Will Elliot stop the big villains? Will he team up with Mr. Robot? Will he? Mr. Robot says, if you do this, you will have set in motion the largest revolution in the history of the world. Now, how do we decide a question like that? With a montage, because the hero goes away, says, I don't know about this. We hear Neil Diamond's If You Go Away play as we see him thinking as he walks down the subway. Is he going to do this? Will Elliot find and stop the real villains? And we're at our second end point. We're at the end of the third act, and it looks like he's going to maybe do it, but we don't know. Elliot's thinking about it, and we see him go online and check Angela's debt. Angela owes $200,000 in student debt. Will he help her? He could. But guess what? Elliot decides not to do it. This is now the fourth act. We're headed for, in the fourth act, both the low point for the hero and also the high point for the hero. It all happens in Act 4. The obstacle point, which is the moment when he seems to fail, and the climax when he seems finally to succeed. Elliot decides not to frame the villain, so the next day he goes back in and they meet. And they meet with the big, fat, apparent villain. And he says to them, okay, so did you find out why we got hacked or not?